Cool. So my name is Nick Stockton. I am 37 years old. I live in Pittsburgh currently, but originally Californian.
Okay. So, thanks again for making the time to talk. And so, you wrote at some point an email to me that you feel your relationship with gaming culture is weird. And so I guess that's just probably a good place to start. So if you could just talk a little bit about weird how, and how did you start to realize that it was weird?
Right. So, I encountered your blog as sort of your project sort of through my weird relationship to video games, which is, I feel like it's weird. It's very tangential. I don't really play video games, but I really enjoy reading about them. I enjoy watching other people play them. I just kind of enjoy video game culture as a spectator, in a sense. But I don't watch Twitch streams or anything like that. Or I occasionally watch YouTube playthroughs. But mostly it's reading about the video game or trying to convince friends or somebody to buy the video game so I can sit and watch them play. And then I read a lot about video games, and I read interviews about people who make or play video games. And I came across your blog. You'd interviewed Kevin Nguyen, who used to be in a Slack group that I was in.
Oh, sure.
And,
yeah.
His interview was great, and I just started through that reading a bunch of interviews, and I was like, this is a guy can maybe psychoanalyze me.
Yes, I forgot to ask for your copay. But using a word like weird has a lot of baggage, and I don't know. There may be, arguably, maybe there's no one with an even weirder relationship with games and gaming culture than me, because it's just not something that a typical person does, is open up their time and their life to hundreds of people to just listen to and talk about this stuff with. But in your estimation, if you are weird, then what is a healthy or a typical relationship with gaming culture? Because I think this has sort of been, you mentioned your age or around the same age. I mean, you're younger than you. I don't know if it's a generational schism. We're of the age where we would remember the whole point of games is to not wait for it to be your turn, is to play yourself. And it's just, I think that also is just a weird thing that I think that is a bit of an obstacle for people over a certain age of I love video games, but I don't really want to play them. I just want to watch other people. So what is a healthier or more typical relationship with gaming culture? I don't even want to throw out guesses, because I'm just curious to hear what's healthy or typical to you.
Right. Yeah. I think. I think I thought of myself as weird is because a lot of times when there's a video game going on, people will be like, "Hey, do you want to play?" Or "Have you played this new game?" Or I'll get into video game discussions with people, and then eventually the discussion kind of comes around to "Oh no, I actually never played that game," or I guess more typically it seems like you're somebody who has actually played it or who has enjoys the actual act of doing it. It's weird to me in the same sense of people that are really huge football fans but never play football, or really big. Yeah, I guess that's not actually that weird, because I was into tennis. I played tennis, but I was into watching tennis before playing tennis. Mm-hmm. So I guess it's not that weird. But, in conversations when I talk about video games, and I enjoy talking about video games with people, that's something it's always I seem like I'm the only one that doesn't actually ever play it, has this kind of relationship that I do. Not that I obsess over it, but it was something that kind of came to mind as I was reading your blog.
Yeah. So, and then so you say weird. I'm not going to harp on that word the whole time. But so I guess I'm curious, just to connect dots from weird, do you feel that a person such as yourself who, I guess engages from the sidelines, for lack of a better term, although I don't know what the sidelines are, what's the difference between, because to me, I would think you spend time with it. It doesn't matter, if you have a controller in your hand, you're still engaging with it. But do you feel that someone who engages in the way that you do you feel you're kind of invisible, or when you're reading about stuff about gaming culture or whatever, do people even realize that people like you exist?
I don't know. I mean, it kind of, if anything, it kind of feels like being a poser, where it's I'll make a joke about, one of my girlfriend's friends plays Overwatch.
Yeah.
And I made he was talking about it and saying something. And I was like, oh man, do you mean Kenji or what? And he's like, no way, dude. You cannot blame me of that. And then I felt like he was like asking me about Overwatch stuff. And I was like, oh, I feel like a poser because like I don't play this game, but I'm like making these jokes about, they're kind of niche jokes just because like I've read about it.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Well, so I think that like, I'm glad that you brought up like, tennis and other stuff, because like lately I've been thinking about the ways that video games used to be perceived as weird, although it's still in the air. I feel like other stuff is sort of quote unquote caught up. Not that video games were like far ahead of other stuff. It's just because of the technology, because of the audience at the time, they just sort of were connected through technology sooner, and I think sort of went through these. They sort of like ran the simulation of relating to or connecting with a hobby or a pastime in a specific way. But lately I've been thinking about how like, well, what's really the difference between really being into video games, and so like we'll use tennis, although you probably know more about tennis than I do. Like, what's really the difference between those two if you're just a fan on the sidelines, and one of them you have a digital avatar and the other one you have sort of like, you're a fan of a real person, you have like an analog avatar. And so I think that like under the umbrella of both of these things, I think sort of the way you and I were talking about it is sort of like, well, why do video games matter to human society? I don't really know. I mean, that's probably like a question we'll chisel at from a couple of different ways. But like, like, do you have a feeling that like video games seem to matter? I don't know. I'm split between like should we just touch on that question first before we splinter off? Maybe that would make the most sense. Like, it's like, why do you think video games matter to human society?
That's the coolest question I think of all. Like, that's the question that keeps on giving. I don't know. Like,
I'm giving it to you right now.
I think maybe that's what's so fascinating about it. Like, it's kind of like this. It's circular, I guess. Like, it's this thing that. I mean, I don't think it's self-fulfilling. Like, video games matter because of they were inevitable in any way or whatever. It's just like a thing that happened to scratch this certain itch because the technology was available and there was like enough disposable income in society and like enough free time, or like culture has gotten to this point where a certain thing, this certain pastime could be this thing. And now video games are that thing that kind of like have become so important. And I think I mentioned, I don't want to like do the referring to our email thread and
sure,
having people listen to this, I know what we're talking about. But in that, you'd ask me a question about like what makes video games mainstream, or the fact that they are recreation, and like it's this recreational activity that is like so important. But recreation has always been so important, and video games are just like this manifestation of like this thing that people always kind of seek out. And it's a weird version of it where it's like, I don't know, we'd have to dig at it more, but like it's just so fascinating, like the ways that it plays out and like the type of games people want to play, and like ending up being the type of games that are created for them. It's not like a thing like a sport where you can just be like, oh, okay, like we have a stick and we have a square, so let's make a game that involves a stick and a square or whatever. Like you have to play the game that is like given to you. So like it has like, I don't know, it's so fascinating. Like, I mean, I like reading about sports too, because like the history of the sports where they came about is like this like recreation by necessity, and like what was available versus like, if you have something that like whatever societal structure you're into is like kind of handed down to you, that's what you end up doing for recreation. And video games fit this like really interesting role in there where they're just like, I don't know, I'm like rambling at this point, so I'm going to toss it back to you. But what video games mean is just like this, they show so much of what humanity seems to always look for in terms of like recreation, and they kind of expose what we search for, and then also are reshaping like what human society is by the fact that like we're playing them. Like just like baseball or football or like other sports or recreation activities have shaped culture too, just because they were the sport that happened out in history that went along with society. Society was moving. And video games are doing the same kind of thing in certain ways.
So, like, one thing I've been wondering about, I mean, you're getting me, like, fresh off of sort of being submerged in my hermit cave for many, many, many months, so it may not be instantly clear, sort of, like, why I'm surfacing with these thoughts. I'm not sure that it's clear to me either, other than just the process of, like, reconnecting with my thoughts in between these two clotheslines of other people's thoughts that I have going through my head.
Right.
But, you know, like, I often frequently wonder, like, do all parts sort of reflect the whole? Like if we're talking about video games and tennis, like, do they both, in their own separate ways, say the same thing about us as humans? Or do they say different things about us, and together that makes the whole?
It's a really good question. It brings to mind, so in my profession, I'm a journalist. I write about science. And one of the stories that I've been wanting to write forever, but, you know, can't really write because there's no science into this, is which sports sound is the most satisfying sound.
Yeah.
To like, and what does sound do as far as like satisfaction for athletes? And how, like, the whoosh of a basket, or like the crack of a bat, or like the pop of a tennis ball. There's something like really satisfying about that. And like, you know it when you, like, whatever sport you're into, like, you know when you hit a tennis ball just right and you hear that pop and you get that kind of haptic feedback too. And like, what is it that draws, like, to me, I'm really drawn to that noise. And like, what is it? That's like one of the many things that draws me to tennis. So like, what is it that draws people to video games too? And like, there's that. I think that is like kind of a roundabout way of like addressing that question. Is like, what is it about video games that scratches this itch that, you know, in a really broad sense, I think my own hypothesis is that like we need things to like we need games of some sort or some kind of recreation. Mm-hmm. But what is it specifically about video games? And then also like, once you dig into like the genres, like what is it about like JRPGs that like really gets like makes this like huge cult following? And like, I don't want to call it cult following. People think like JRPGs are underground. They're like one of the biggest genres there is. It's insane.
Yeah, I think the J in that is key. So if you talk to people in the West, they're gonna maybe not have even heard of that. You know, that's the other thing too, is that there's like a generational vector on all of this, and so it means different things to different people depending on their experiences. But also, you know, some of them may be parents, and some of them may have grown up having not been allowed to play games, and I just lost my train of thought, of course, but, you know, I think what I'm sort of reacting to what you were saying is like, you know, I know what they used to say, and I guess this is part of the generational thing, is being mid-30s and not having kids and not knowing what what sort of like how kids you know, interact with the same stuff that we're talking about. But like, I know what they used to say, like in our generation, which is like, people play video games. I think like at the outset, I think like if you were to go chronologically, it's like people play video games because they're losers, because they don't know how to connect with other people. Like it had all these negative connotations, and then there started to emerge like, oh, well, you can play them for the stories. And I think that became sort of, you know, less laughable as video games start to have like, like they have like actual actors doing the motion capture, like it's actually like, you know, their likeness in it, not just their voices. Like I think visibly it's sort of caught up that like people in other realms of storytelling are interested and see the potential in video games. But even as that has started to shift, you know, and I guess there's also like a kind of shallow perception that people have that like, oh, well, you can make a lot of money from playing video games, although that seems weird to people. But I feel like, is that really it? Are those really the only perceptions now of sort of like why people play video games? Because they're losers, because it's fun, because they can make money, or because they're interested in the stories? Like there has to be more.
Well, I think that kind of touches on like, I mean, that seems like the generational thing that always happens. Like whatever the younger generation is into, like the older generation is like, oh, this sucks. This has no soul. It's a waste of time. And then like now, like you said, you and I are grown up. Wow. You know, there's kids, and now we're like, oh no, like we've created all these justifications and these things of like, oh no, like video games are actually a way to make money. Like they help your reflexes, like their storytelling, which like are things that may or may not have always been true about video games. Like I think they're true. Like it's still arguable, you know.
Yeah.
But I think that's kind of speaking a lot to the generational side of like these things always have value. It's just kind of like who's in power at that time. Like who are the adults speaking? Like when I refer to power, and what do they value, and like those values trickle down. And I feel like you and I, you know, when I say I have a weird relationship with video games, and I kind of, you know, I think a lot of that comes from the thing that you're talking about, where it's like I have this like I always kind of feel like my parents are looking over my shoulder. I'm like, what are you reading on Wikipedia right now? What are you wasting your time on? Like versus like my nephews, my brother's kids, and my brother's like, oh yeah, like, you know, he's dope at Minecraft, and like he sits and watches Minecraft videos on YouTube for, you know, hours a day. And like my brother's like, that's awesome. Like he's great at it. I'm so proud of him. And I'm like, I mean, maybe that's just my brother's a cool dad, or like maybe it's like a generational thing. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, you mentioned tennis. It's weird because often in these types of conversations, I mention tennis just because, like, I bring it up. I don't really know much about it, but I know it's a thing people have heard of. Unlike more specific, granular things about games, but like, you know, like in my experience and in my research and in my, you know, work with this, like, my sense is like most things seem to go through those same, you know, ebbs and flows of perception. But like, I don't know, did tennis, like, were people initially very against tennis? And speaking of like how it was a waste of time, like I just don't know the history. I'm also not much of a sports guy, so like I know a little bit about football through friends of mine who are really into football, and I grew up, you know, in the Chicago area watching the Bulls and stuff. But that's, I mean, I'm talking about the 1990s Bulls. Tennis is not really much on my radar, but did it go through similar things that like video games did?
I think that's a tough one. Tennis has kind of a contested history. A lot of people think it dates back to like the Roman times. I think it actually does. And then it kind of like had a resurgence, like it was reformalized in Britain and stuff. And I think there's debates about kind of like with soccer, if you know the history of soccer, like there's debates about what was originally soccer, and like there was, you know, when it became reformalized and when it became the recognizable soccer we know today versus like some proto soccer or some proto tennis, if we're talking about tennis again. And I think that, to your point, and to defend my own argument, I guess, I think it's, A, it's hard to say, and B, like, I think that the way that culture and the way that like recreation and stuff came about in the past was maybe a lot different than it is today, where now every generation, like technology moves really fast, and like every generation kind of has a new, you know, musical genres come and go really quick, or, you know, not come and go, but like they come really quickly.
Right.
And, you know, we want to, I don't know, we crap on dubstep or like these genres that like weren't around when we were around, like they don't make sense to us. And I don't want to loop you into that. I don't want to loop myself. Dubstep's okay, I guess, but but like I think that, and maybe, you know, I'm definitely overgeneralizing, but I do think that there is some of that. Like, I think that the older generation is maybe just blind to like the values of a thing that a thing might have, like video games or something that, you know, a younger generation likes to spend its time doing, versus like, I think when tennis came about, it was maybe a more, and you know, this is me hypothesizing, I read some on history of tennis, but it was like it was a longer like evolution. And so like the things that the kids were playing that looked like sort of tennis, like the adults would have been like, oh, we didn't play it like that. We did this rule. You guys are doing the rule wrong. But it wasn't like this entirely brand new thing that just like sprung up overnight, kind of like video games.
Yeah. Yeah, I always feel like when I hear people say that they're basically like, they're one of those people who say like, oh, there hasn't been a good jazz record since the 30s, and all this stuff is shit since then. But you know, I guess like one of the other things I was wondering is like, so I mean, you brought up mainstreaming, and that's a thing I think about a lot. But I mean, what do you think it says about us that things that are quote unquote weird can be important to us? Like, even if, I think, as you said, like things are always in the process of mainstreaming, and there is a generational thing here. I mean, I guess like there's 3-4 questions here, but like to start, like are there things that, at least like from your position, like, you know, on the sidelines, if that's the way you would characterize it or not, like what seems weird to you about video games, sort of like the way they're thought of or talked of or not talked about, or do they not seem weird to you in that regard?
I think maybe the weirdest thing is, my own, I guess, relation to them notwithstanding. One of the weirdest things is just how they kind of do still carry this baggage of being a like a niche or like a thing that only a certain subtype of people are into.
Yeah.
Where it seems like, everybody is playing some sort of video game now, whether it's a console or a computer or like on their phone. They're just ubiquitous, and like it's, and I'm not criticizing it or anything. It's one of these things I just think is so interesting, like the baggage that things carry and like the associations that things carry. Like, I don't know. I think about like improv, where people still get kind of like poked at for being like improv. Yeah, I don't do improv, but improv is one of these things where it's like, oh yeah, you do improv, like But we're all kind of like improv is kind of seeped into the culture to the point where like people are doing improv all the time, and they might not even know they're doing it, but because of the culture they consume has so much like improv influence. It's like it's something they do. Same with like similar to video games. Like people don't even consider like, oh, I'm playing Candy Crush on my phone. Like they don't consider themselves a gamer, but like they're spending an hour a day doing it because they're doing it on the subway each way. Like, yeah, like that's kind of a gamer right there.
Yeah, I mean, in my experience, like a lot of people, like in some ways it does a disservice to just publish one interview after the other, because it gives the impression, oh, everyone has something to say about this. Like I'm always interested in that sort of meta stuff of like, like asking people like, oh, well, why did you want to talk? And what are the things you feel like people don't really talk about? Because I think there's a lot of just interesting, I think that's where like a lot of the stuff lives. But like I feel like a lot of people, and that's vague, but in my experience, like a lot of people, they either don't want to be identified as a gamer, or they don't want to identify as like having something to say about this stuff, or like I think for some people, like in my experience, like walking around or running around and doing all these interviews, like I don't even know what word I would use to describe like the tone that it takes when you actually hold still with someone and have a conversation, especially just two people who don't really know each other, versus like the way that it tends to be talked about online. I mean, like if you had to like put like one word on sort of like the tone that you sort of observe in most conversations about video games, what is the tone that you tend to encounter?
I think it depends on who's around. Like,
yeah.
A lot of times if it's like at a party and there's like other stuff, there's kind of like this like apologetic tone. Like, all right, we're gonna talk about Suikoden for a little bit, and like y'all gotta chill. Like, let us hash it out.
Yeah.
But like if it's gamers by themselves, like I was at the farmer's market. This is a terrible story. I was at the farmer's market the other day, and there's like I just happened to hear two dudes talking about the Fantastic Four together, and they were having the most like intense conversation. It was a conversation where like if they were in a mixed company or whatever with quote unquote civilians, like they'd be like there would be kind of like that apologetic tone of their voice. Okay, like yeah, like Johnny Blaze, like okay, like but seriously though.
Well, I mean, again, I guess I'll just keep coming back to tennis. I mean, I think that's true that like in a mixed company, you can never really assume familiarity, but I guess that's the other thing too. Like we were talking about perceptions of people who play games, gamers, whatever, and I think that like myopia is another one that tends to be in there where people who play games, that's like their entire media consumption diet, and that they have little or no interest in other things. And I think that sometimes can be true. But I mean, can't that be true of like all things? Like, can't that be true if like you're really into tennis, maybe you're not interested in other stuff too?
Totally. I think it's totally the case. I think that there's like, again, that like, and then, this is all my bias. This is probably saying more about me than I'm saying about anything in society. But like, it seems like with tennis or with sports or with certain types of cultural things, like it's totally okay to just like jump in the conversation, and like people will say it without any kind of like self-awareness, I guess, versus like if you're talking about video games and you are in Nick's company or whatever, like you're outside of a game shop, there is you're going to be posturing in some way or the other, and it's like it kind of has a lot, like anything that's kind of like a genre, like a quote unquote genre activity, like talking about sci-fi or fantasy or comic books or anything that's in like nerd culture or whatever that means, kind of seems to have this. The one thing that really breaks through in this that I thought was interesting is like Game of Thrones is like become this thing where people will talk about it self-consciously, sort of, in the same way that they would talk about, I guess, Friends or, Breaking Bad or some other TV show. The only real like self-consciousness is like, okay, no spoilers, okay, but like let's do this.
Yeah.
There's not like an embarrassment of like I'm into this thing or like I need to make sure you're not going to get bored about me talking about this thing. I mean, it's just like, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you're saying that reminds me of another interview I did where I was talking to someone else, and she said that like something that used to be perceived the way video games did, but that the perception had changed was online dating. And I think that that's true in the way of like what you're talking about with like, genre fantasy in certain respects. Like, so I just wonder, and I know that I always have my finger on the pulse of this, and I'm always trying to figure out like who would be a person to have an interesting conversation with, or what's a parallel I could explore, or what are ways in which I'm feeling that certain things are lacking in the ecosystem, so I do want to come back to that question, like what does that say about us that things that are weird can be important to us? But I think another question I want to throw onto it first is like, well, who decides what's weird? like who's sending out those messages that like ripple down to you or me, where we pick up that like, yeah, there is something weird about this, even if it's not exhibited in our own behavior or our own conversations.
Right. I think that's a really, fascinating question. It's like, what is the turning point where, like, I feel like this started happening with anime recently. Like, there was like a big sports star or something who admitted like he was into like Dragon Ball, or he was, no, it wasn't even Dragon Ball. It was like a really niche like anime, and then it was like a bunch of people on Twitter were like, oh yeah, dude, I love that thing too. Like, and I was like, oh man, and now anime seems to kind of be making this turn of like, it's kind of like becoming a cool thing where people are like maybe self-consciously talking about anime because they're like, signaling like, oh yeah, I'm into that too now. And this is just my hypothesizing, like, then maybe the next step is like, oh, then it's just like a normal thing that like everybody is like just talking about. But I don't know, like there's still things like Rocky Horror Picture Show, which is like simultaneously a mainstream thing, but also like a cult thing, which like, I don't know, man, these are all the threads of like culture that I think are so fascinating. Like,
yeah, and I don't know if is it just like I don't know what it is in human nature. Like some people hear, like that used to be it would cause a lot of friction to sort of even mention that like there are these divisions in culture, and the video games are not mainstream in the way that whoever you're talking to thinks that they are, and then you get it just totally derails. And so like is it implicit that like things that are weird have to someday not be weird? Is it certain like I'm remembering another interview now. I'm sorry, all these things are just freshly coming back to my mind. But like I think this was an interview I did with a media theorist, Douglas Rushkoff, where he was saying that sort of like this is sort of the nature of culture. Not so much that it tries to beat a path to mainstream acceptance, but that it tends to want to outdo itself, whether it be, punks and piercing and acts of vandalism or whatever. And he said, like, sort of the only way you can assure that a culture will not keep trying to outdo itself is if it's rallied around some sort of illegal activity. Like, you don't see the mafia like flirting with trying to get noticed more and more. They want to try to stay under the radar as much as possible. But I wonder, it's like, I think there is truth in that is just the nature of who we are. But I wonder, like, I think I can come down on some of this stuff with like, well, it kind of hurts it in some ways that it's not seen as, that it's still seen as weird because it like affects things like, like the seriousness of, you know, labor practices in the space, or sort of inequalities with the way journalism is approached, which I'm sure you can understand with what you do. But I mean, is it sort of implicit? Like, it's so hard because these things are so big. But I mean, like, does it matter that things are weird? Do we have some sort of internal drive to like need to prove that they're not weird to other people? Like, can't things just stay weird?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of texture to that question. Like, one, I think, like, you know, it's always contextual. Like, there's going to be some kid in, like, Duluth, Minnesota who's with a crew, like, in that high, like, I'm not even going to go abstract, like, legit, real story. Like, in college, I was roommates with these kids. They were all from, like, San Rafael, California. And, like, when I went to high school in, like, Central Valley, California, which is very... it's very similar, I guess, to like stereotypical Texas version of high school. It's very cliquey and like, you know, jocks rule, nerds drool, that kind of stuff. Their high school, like the coolest kids at their high school was like the artists, and like they were all like art kids, and they were all like super cool. Like, and I was like, what? Like, what? How? Like, why didn't I go to that school? That's so cool. And like, you know, it reminded me of like, what was that movie, The 22 Jump Street, where like, with Seth Rogen, what's the younger Seth Rogen kid? Jonah Hill.
Yeah.
Him and they go back to high school, and like the like all the cool kids are like, hey man, don't be a homophobe, like, and they're like, all wait, like everything's upside down in high school now, like what? It just reminded me of that. So like, I think it's all contextual, which is a cop out, but also like I think that there's so many threads happening at once.
Yeah.
In culture, like the things we think are weird, and like, why can't they stay weird? Why can't they stay static? Like, are things always destined to be cult one way or the other? And I think that there's like, this is going to be, have you ever like read into this group of philosophers called the Frankfurt School?
Yeah, I have, but for people who may be listening that aren't familiar, if you could elaborate, that would be good. I know a little bit about it, but not as much as I'm guessing you might.
I don't know if I do or not.
Okay, I've heard it.
So the Frankfurt School is this group of philosophers in Frankfurt, Germany, and they got together kind of like Weimar Republic era, like right before Nazi Germany rose up.
Right.
And their whole idea was to like examine capitalism, and not in the way like, yeah, they were very critical of it, but in a way where it's like, in a philosophical way where it's like, yeah, we're going to be critical of it, but in a critical way where like, what are the effects and causes, and like, just how does capitalism shape a society? And, you know, they ended up getting kicked out of Germany, and because of their, you know, being critical of capitalism and being viewed as having communist sympathies, which they probably did. But to get to my point, one of the really interesting things I thought was written there was by this guy named Felix Adorno, and he had a co-author, I can't remember his name, but they wrote a book called The Culture Industry, and in that they kind of just describe how culture works in a capitalist society. And one of the things they talked about is like, when there is like, things can come up organically, like a cultural, like you know, punk or hip hop, they come up, and kind of the cycle of those becoming like a big cultural phenomenon, and how, you know, capitalism latches onto cultural things and turns them into things where they're to be bought and sold and consumed. And within that are like all these different textural threads. Like there's not like a straight trajectory for anything. Like there's no simple like, like this thing's going to be you know, this is like basketball or whatever, where it's like, oh, it's like three dudes were playing it in their front yard, and now it's like the national sensation. Like those stories are so rare to the point that there's not, you know, there's no template, there's no baseline. And so each kind of like, you know, there are some generalizations you can make about how, you know, niche things become commodified. And I think it's, that they kind of say it's inevitable in a capitalist society that like anything that's cool or anything that people are into as a cultural, you know, thing or a cultural identity will inevitably become commodified. But like the way that comes about, it's always going to be kind of unique to what that thing is, and also like the contextual historical things that are going on. And I just like, I mean, that's what's so, I think about that book all the freaking time when I'm thinking about video games. Is just, you know, the conversation we're having right now. It's like, why is this so cool? Like, why am I into this way? Like, why do I care about this so much? And why is it like, why do so many other people care about this so much? Why did why did this video game become so huge? And why is there so much emotional attachment to like Cloud Strife? Like, why is Cloud Strife so emotionally and like kinetically charged with so much in culture? And like, whoever the main character in Final Fantasy VIII, nobody knows who the hell he is, or maybe there's probably some subculture that he is super important to, and like, I don't know, like this, I don't know, this stuff's fascinating. I went on a huge tangent right there.
No,
I hope that made sense.
Yeah, that's well, you're in good company here when it comes to that sort of behavior. Like I'm with a lot of the stuff you were saying. I mean, I wonder how much of that is connected with like. I guess I'm just curious, like, about your sort of where you've your destination here of like not really playing them. Like, I would be curious to hear a little bit about like that choice and whether it was an active decision. Like, are you interested in preserving some sort of critical distance and trying to understand some of these things? Is it you don't have the time, you don't have the money, you don't have the interest? Like, I don't know. I'm just curious. I mean, like, I can tell you for my part, like, with what I've been doing, at some point it became necessary, I think, just to get necessary perspective on a lot of the sort of the dramas, et cetera, that people talk about and get very consumed by, that they sort of lose the bigger picture and sort of lose the sense that, like, maybe the average person has actually never heard of this thing. And then that doesn't in any way minimize its importance, but if you can't really explain your thoughts to other people, then it just sort of stays behind these, they're basically just membrane walls online. There's really no reason, because a tweet about video games can show up next to a tweet about anything else, and yet it can still be worlds apart. And so that's my tangent there for you. But like, I guess I'm just curious, like, sort of what was behind your decision to not sort of really play or engage with games in that way?
Right. I mean, I don't know if I'd call it it's more of an impulse, I think, or just like a lack of impulse. And, I think it's most likely stemmed from just being like a person who really craves social interaction.
Yeah.
More than, and it's like some of my fondest memories, and this is going to maybe sound super depressing to certain people, but like just being in a room and watching, like hanging out with a friend and watching them play a video game. Like, I remember, I don't know if I mentioned this in our email thread or not, I guess it doesn't matter. But like watching one of my best friends play Half-Life 2, and like I would go over we were in the military together, and I would go to his like dorm room, basically his barracks room, and like every day after we got out of work, and like just sit and watch him play Half-Life 2 for I don't know how long, like a week or two on end, and like just so many good times hanging out there watching me. He'd be like, "Hey, do you want to play? And I'm like, "Oh, no, not really, man. Keep going because you're good at it." And I'm like, I'm pretty terrible at this game. Similar with like the first Resident Evil, like my first encounter with that game was like at a party, and there's that first jump scare where the zombie grabs the main character's leg in the hallway, and like I've never been more terrified in my life in that moment. It was like such a charged moment, and part of it was like being in this room and everybody in there was just like screaming and like, "Wah!"
Yeah.
And it's just kind of always been that. When I played video games, like last summer I played Castlevania Symphony of the Night, and it was awesome, but it was like more of a like, I was like, I think in that instance I was kind of like not wanting to do my work, and just like that was a good excuse to not do work or something.
I had a similar experience. I actually played that same game either over the quote unquote winter break or over the summer break. It was in some lull while working on the book, and I had never played it before. And even though I have these conversations with people all the time, I do recognize it's a very weird thing to be asked, much less to answer. Like, why do you play games? Why do you not play? I think that's very much in the DNA of sort of like what you and I are here to talk about, is like just how abstract, arbitrary, individual, etc. these decisions are at the macro level, much less like, when you get down to a particular genre and why or why not you are interested or follow it. I think for me, it's just like, for me, it's become this thing where it's like a chapter of a book before bed at night. Although more recently, that time has been replaced by like watching movies where I want to do even less. I don't want to even hold a controller. But you know, like doing what I do, just spending all my time staring at words, I really appreciate having a thing to do with my time where I don't have to read, I don't have to edit, I don't have to, I don't have to think.
Totally.
And I've always valued that aspect of video games is the sort of, you know, plug in and then turn off. Mainly because I'm just thinking all the time, the rest of the time. But you know, I have this experience with friends too, where as we get older, we try to, you know, cajole each other into playing some game so that we can watch them play. like I'm not as interested in like Twitch and stuff personally, but you know, if I can watch like a good friend of mine play a game, it's enjoyable in a way that I've never really thought about, but is like, I guess, like a bonding activity in a weird way. But I know for people who don't follow this stuff, they sort of get mystified around video games when they think about the way it informs like relationships, like the way that it actually informs like, you know, real people and how they interact with each other. They're just, I think they're even mystified by a thing like Twitch. But you know, I wonder if, you know, are there ways that we get to know each other through that activity that we don't through other digital channels? Like, can you learn something about your friend, you know, watching them play Half-Life 2 or Resident Evil that you could never learn in a lifetime of texting or calling or Skype calls?
Oh, absolutely. I'm like chomping at the bit. I think so much. I think like with returning to one of my friend playing Half-Life 2, like,
yeah,
I think he's one of the most competent people that I know, and part of that, I swear, some of that is like watching him play that game, because he's like so sick at first-person shooters, and like is so confident, always knows like, okay, I need to go do this, I need to go do this, and has like this like really good tactical mind and can like navigate through this, that was like the first year of our friendship, when like, you know, first months of our friendship, when we were hanging out doing that. I think that was like really formative in like forming my opinion of who he is. And like, I think it's kind of like in a game like that, it's like being able to crawl, like it's being like, if your buddy's like really good at football, not to like keep jumping back to sports metaphors, but like if your buddy's really good at football, you get to like jump inside his helmet and be like, you're also being like a co-pilot, like, dude, go there, go there, go there. And like they're doing what you're saying to some degree, like, no, I'm going to do this. And you're kind of like this co-pilot, like you're R2-D2 for them, and just like helping them do like what they need to do. And same, like my little brother's in the Marines, whenever he comes home, like we'll get together, and like one of the few times I play video games when he comes home, and we'll, you know, put in like Call of Duty or Titanfall or something, and like just take turns like dying, like whoever dies, you know, pass the controller. He never dies, and I die all the time. But it's more of like a bonding thing, and we don't like, you know, he's like a teen still, basically. We don't have much to talk about as far as like what our interests in life are. Like, you know, I'm worried about like taxes and, you know, word count and stuff like that. He's like, oh yeah, like he's worried about like marine stuff, and like, but we can bond and like we can spend time together, and it's like quality time, and we're like, you know, we're not talking about big ideas or like what we're into in our lives. We're like, you know, it's just this like maybe zen, like we're sharing a moment together, and like, I don't know if I'm learning like, you know, a more tactical, like a thing like I learned with my friend with Half-Life, where I'm like, oh, I'm generating an impression with him or whatever. And like, but it's more of like, we're hanging out in a way that we wouldn't really be able to hang out, because there's like a 15-year age difference between us, and we don't have a lot in common otherwise, but we can hang out and play this video game together. And like, and that's really cool. And I think that that's something that like you can't really replicate in a lot of other media, you know, where you're just either passively consuming it or like, you know, if we were to play sports together, he'd be so much better than me that it wouldn't really be the same. Like, even though I suck at video games, he's good at it, we can still interact because I'm like talking to him, and like we're sharing this experience of like beating the game together. Even though it's like 90% him beating the game, and like, but I'm there, like I'm like, shoot that guy, cool.
So, I mean, I said that, and I don't know if you necessarily agreed with what I just said when I said that it sort of mystifies people when it comes to how video games intersect with the way real people relate to each other. Like, like that makes sense to you and me, and we both have spent time around or with video games, but why do you think that still seems weird to people who haven't really spent time around or with video games? Or do you disagree with that and it doesn't seem weird to people anymore and it's just the weirdos that I'm around?
I'm sorry I skirted that point of your question before. I got really excited about the other stuff.
No.
But yeah, I think it's, people aren't, if it seems weird to them, I think it's maybe because they just still don't play them or whatever. It's like, if I'm telling somebody about, my Warhammer my tabletop wargaming obsession, like it seems super weird. But like if they see it in action, I was like, oh, it's just like people bonding in like a very, very weird way, like admittedly. And again, coming back to this word weird, I definitely think tabletop wargaming is pretty weird as a huge fan. But I think it's like any really niche thing that like I don't know, like there's partly also like there's not a huge social payoff, it seems like.
Yeah.
Like versus like being really sick at guitar or like being really good at like some sport, like you don't look cool to people doing it. And this gets into like what is cool like aesthetically and like what do people appreciate, which is another conversation when you start thinking about like, like 420 no scope videos and like, wait, there's an audience for that too. There's people who do think that's cool.